Title: The Circle of Ascension. Chapter 1. The Invitation. The rain had been relentless for days, each drop tapping a mournful rhythm against the window panes of Jack Morrison's modest apartment. The weather seemed to echo his grief, a cold and constant reminder of the loss that had consumed his life. His wife Maria and their young daughter Lily had been taken from him in an accident that had shattered his world into pieces. It had been 6 months, but the wound still felt as fresh as if it had happened yesterday. Sitting hunched over his desk, Jack's mind wandered between the unfinished graphic design projects scattered across his computer screen and the haunting images of that night. Metal screeching against metal, the blinding lights, and the deafening silence that followed. No matter how hard he worked, no matter how much he immersed himself in his job, the dark void they had left behind never seemed to loosen its grip on him. Then, one evening, as he sifted through the usual pile of bills and advertisements, something unusual caught his eye. A thick, cream-colored envelope. It was unmistakable, out of place amid the mundane letters. There was no return address, only his name written in elegant, flowing script. The handwriting was unfamiliar, yet strangely personal, as though it carried an invitation to something significant. Curiosity piqued. Jack slipped the envelope open with a careful, almost reverent motion. Inside was a single sheet of heavy, textured paper. The letter was adorned with intricate designs, strange symbols that seemed to pulse with a life of their own, as if they were more than just decoration. The words were written in ornate, looping text, and Jack felt his heartbeat quicken as he read. Welcome to the Circle of Ascension. Dear Jack Morrison, we understand the pain you carry and the darkness that envelops your soul. You are not alone in your journey towards healing and enlightenment. We invite you to join us in a transformative experience that will guide you beyond your current suffering and into a realm of profound understanding and peace. Attend our first meeting at the Old Willow Manor, located at 1425 Elm Street, on the evening of the 15th. Come prepared to embrace your true self and ascend beyond the shadows that seek to claim you. With warm regards, Victor Blackwood, founder, The Circle of Ascension. Jack stared at the invitation, his pulse quickening. It was too much, too personal, too well-timed. His eyes scanned the address again. Old Willow Manor. The name sent a shiver down his spine. He had heard of the manor. Everyone had. It was a relic of a forgotten time, a mansion that stood like a sentinel at the edge of town, half hidden by the sprawling branches of ancient willow trees. No one had lived there for years, but the house had always intrigued him. A ghostly presence in the background of his life, now suddenly connected to this mysterious group. The letter's promise of healing, of transcending grief, stirred something deep inside him. He had tried everything else: therapy, self-help books, meditation. But nothing seemed to dull the ache of his loss. This, whatever it was, felt different. The invitation offered something more than the empty platitudes of the world outside. But Jack was no fool. Skepticism had been his armor for years, and a part of him recoiled at the thought of joining some shadowy group, offering vague promises of spiritual ascension. Yet, another part of him, perhaps the part that was still searching for a way out of the pain, felt drawn to it. He had nothing left to lose. After a restless night of thought, he decided to go. He wasn't sure what he expected, but it couldn't be worse than the hollow existence he was enduring. The evening of the 15th arrived, and Jack found himself standing before Old Willow Manor. The house loomed in front of him, its crumbling stone walls and ivy-covered facade, looking both majestic and menacing in the waning light. The willow trees surrounding it swayed gently, their branches like skeletal hands reaching out toward him, as if they too were urging him forward. He hesitated at the front door, feeling an odd mixture of excitement and dread. He had no idea what awaited him inside, but the sense of being watched, a sensation he couldn't shake, was unmistakable. With a deep breath, he turned the ornate brass key that had come with the invitation. The door creaked open slowly, as if the house itself was reluctant to let him in. The air inside was thick with dust and time, the faint smell of decaying wood mixing with the scent of old leather and mildew. A grand chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystals muted and dulled, casting a dim light over the entrance hall. Jack took a cautious step forward, the sound of his footsteps swallowed by the oppressive silence that seemed to hang in the air. The house was vast, its grand staircase spiraling upward like the spine of some long-forgotten creature. The walls were lined with faded tapestries, their colors once vibrant, but now washed out by the years of neglect. And yet, there was something about the place that felt alive, not in the way a living being is alive, but in a way that suggested the house itself had a memory, a history it was waiting to share. As Jack ventured further into the manor, a voice cut through the silence. "Welcome, Jack." He turned to find a man standing at the foot of the staircase. The man was tall, with sharp features and piercing eyes that seemed to gleam with an unsettling intensity. He was dressed impeccably, his black suit fitting him perfectly, his dark hair neatly combed. He exuded an air of authority, but there was something unsettling about the way he stood there, like he had been waiting for Jack's arrival, like he knew something Jack didn't. "You must be Jack," the man continued, his voice smooth and welcoming. "I'm Victor Blackwood. It's a pleasure to finally meet you in person." Jack blinked, trying to gather his thoughts. "Thank you for the invitation," he said, though his voice trembled slightly despite his best efforts to appear composed. Victor stepped forward, extending a hand, and Jack shook it, feeling the firm grip of someone who was used to having control. "I trust your journey here was uneventful." "Uneventful," Jack repeated, though the journey had been anything but he didn't feel the need to elaborate. The invitation had been clear. He was here for a reason, and the time for questions hadn't yet come. Victor motioned for Jack to follow him as he turned and walked deeper into the house. They passed through long hallways lined with more tapestries, portraits of people Jack didn't recognize, and doors that led into rooms shrouded in darkness. Everything in the house seemed to breathe, the silence punctuated only by the soft creaking of the wooden floors under their feet. "The Circle of Ascension is a place of transformation," Victor began, his voice low and deliberate. "It is for those who have seen the depths of sorrow and are willing to walk through the fire to find themselves again. You're here because you are ready for change, Jack. You've been called because your suffering is not merely a burden, it is a door, waiting to be opened." Jack nodded, unsure of what to make of Victor's words. There was something undeniably magnetic about the man, an aura of power that made Jack feel small in his presence, but also oddly safe. As they entered a large room at the back of the house, Jack noticed a few other people seated around a circular table. There were no ordinary chairs, only plush armchairs that seemed too comfortable, too welcoming. The air in the room felt thick with anticipation, like the moment before a storm. Victor motioned for Jack to sit at the only empty chair, and as he did, he noticed the others in the room, their faces serene, almost placid, as if they had all been waiting for this moment. Jack's heart raced as he glanced around, taking in the odd expressions on their faces. They all seemed calm, as if they had found the answers he was searching for. But the silence in the room felt unnatural, like they were all waiting for something that would unfold in its own time. Victor's voice broke the stillness again. "Now we begin. The first step is simple, Jack. It is to face the shadows within yourself. Only by acknowledging the darkness inside can you truly begin to ascend beyond it." Jack felt a cold shiver race down his spine. The words, though soothing, carried a weight that seemed to settle in his chest, suffocating him. "Tonight, we begin your journey," Victor continued, his eyes locking with Jack's. "Tonight you will face what you have avoided. You will confront the grief that has haunted you and let it guide you toward the light. Sure, here is the full Chapter 1 rewritten in a continuous cohesive narrative. I will maintain the eerie, unsettling atmosphere and character-driven focus, building tension and introducing mystery as the story unfolds. Chapter 1. The Invitation. The rain had been relentless for days, each drop tapping a mournful rhythm against the window panes of Jack Morrison's modest apartment. The weather seemed to echo his grief, a cold and constant reminder of the loss that had consumed his life. His wife, Maria, and their young daughter, Lily, had been taken from him in an accident that had shattered his world into pieces. It had been 6 months, but the wound still felt as fresh as if it had happened yesterday. Sitting hunched over his desk, Jack's mind wandered between the unfinished graphic design projects scattered across his computer screen. and the haunting images of that night. Metal screeching against metal, the blinding lights, and the deafening silence that followed. No matter how hard he worked, no matter how much he immersed himself in his job, the dark void they had left behind never seemed to loosen its grip on him. Then, one evening, as he sifted through the usual pile of bills and advertisements, something unusual caught his eye: a thick, cream-colored envelope. It was unmistakable, out of place amid the mundane letters. There was no return address, only his name written in elegant, flowing script. The handwriting was unfamiliar, yet strangely personal, as though it carried an invitation to something significant. Curiosity piqued. Jack slipped the envelope open with a careful, almost reverent motion. Inside was a single sheet of heavy, textured paper. The letter was adorned with intricate designs, strange symbols that seemed to pulse with a life of their own, as if they were more than just decoration. The words were written in ornate, looping text, and Jack felt his heartbeat quicken as he read. The welcome to the Circle of Ascension. Dear Jack Morrison, we understand the pain you carry and the darkness that envelops your soul. You are not alone in your journey towards healing and enlightenment. We invite you to join us in a transformative experience that will guide you beyond your current suffering and into a realm of profound understanding and peace. Attend our first meeting at the Old Willow Manor, located at 1425 Elm Street, on the evening of the 15th. Come prepared to embrace your true self and ascend beyond the shadows that seek to claim you. With warm regards, Victor Blackwood, founder, the Circle of Ascension. Jack stared at the invitation, his pulse quickening. It was too much, too personal, too well-timed. His eyes scanned the address again. Old Willow Manor. The name sent a shiver down his spine. He had heard of the manor. Everyone had. It was a relic of a forgotten time, a mansion that stood like a sentinel at the edge of town, half hidden by the sprawling branches of ancient willow trees. No one had lived there for years, but the house had always intrigued him, a ghostly presence in the background of his life, now suddenly connected to this mysterious group. The letter's promise of healing, of transcending grief, stirred something deep inside him. He had tried everything else: therapy, self-help books, meditation, but nothing seemed to dull the ache of his loss. This, whatever it was, felt different. The invitation offered something more than the empty platitudes of the world outside. But Jack was no fool. Skepticism had been his armor for years, and a part of him recoiled at the thought of joining some shadowy group offering vague promises of spiritual ascension. Yet, another part of him, perhaps the part that was still searching for a way out of the pain, felt drawn to it. He had nothing left to lose. After a restless night of thought, he decided to go. He wasn't sure what he expected, but it couldn't be worse than the hollow existence he was enduring. B.C. At the evening of the 15th arrived, and Jack found himself standing before Old Willow Manor. The house loomed in front of him, its crumbling stone walls and ivy-covered facade looking both majestic and menacing in the waning light. The willow trees surrounding it swayed gently, their branches like skeletal hands reaching out toward him, as if they too were urging him forward. He hesitated at the front door, feeling an odd mixture of excitement and dread. He had no idea what awaited him inside, but the sense of being watched, a sensation he couldn't shake, was unmistakable. With a deep breath, he turned the ornate brass key that had come with the invitation. The door creaked open slowly, as if the house itself was reluctant to let him in. The air inside was thick with dust and time, the faint smell of decaying wood mixing with the scent of old leather and mildew. A grand chandelier hung from the ceiling, its crystals muted and dulled, casting a dim light over the entrance hall. Jack took a cautious step forward, the sound of his footsteps swallowed by the oppressive silence that seemed to hang in the air. The house was vast, its grand staircase spiraling upward like the spine of some long-forgotten creature. The walls were lined with faded tapestries, their colors once vibrant but now washed out by the years of neglect. And yet, there was something about the place that felt alive. Not in the way a living being is alive, but in a way that suggested the house itself had a memory, a history it was waiting to share. As Jack ventured further into the manor, a voice cut through the silence. "Welcome, Jack." He turned to find a man standing at the foot of the staircase. The man was tall, with sharp features and piercing eyes that seemed to gleam with an unsettling intensity. He was dressed impeccably, his black suit fitting him perfectly, his dark hair neatly combed. He exuded an air of authority, but there was something unsettling about the way he stood there, like he had been waiting for Jack's arrival, like he knew something Jack didn't. "You must be Jack," the man continued, his voice smooth and welcoming. "I'm Victor Blackwood. It's a pleasure to finally meet you in person." Jack blinked, trying to gather his thoughts. "Thank you for the invitation," he said, though his voice trembled slightly despite his best efforts to appear composed. Victor stepped forward, extending a hand, and Jack shook it, feeling the firm grip of someone who was used to having control. "I trust your journey here was uneventful." "Uneventful," Jack repeated, though the journey had been anything but. But he didn't feel the need to elaborate. The invitation had been clear. He was here for a reason, and the time for questions hadn't yet come. Victor motioned for Jack to follow him as he turned and walked deeper into the house. They passed through long hallways lined with more tapestries, portraits of people Jack didn't recognize, and doors that led into rooms shrouded in darkness. Everything in the house seemed to breathe, the silence punctuated only by the soft creaking of the wooden floors under their feet. "The Circle of Ascension is a place of transformation," Victor began, his voice low and deliberate. "It is for those who have seen the depths of sorrow and are willing to walk through the fire to find themselves again. You're here because you are ready for change, Jack. You've been called because your suffering is not merely a burden, it is a door waiting to be opened." Jack nodded, unsure of what to make of Victor's words. There was something undeniably magnetic about the man, an aura of power that made Jack feel small in his presence, but also oddly safe. As they entered a large room at the back of the house, Jack noticed a few other people seated around a circular table. There were no ordinary chairs, only plush armchairs that seemed too comfortable, too welcoming. The air in the room felt thick with anticipation, like the moment before a storm. Victor motioned for Jack to sit at the only empty chair, and as he did, he noticed the others in the room, their faces serene, almost placid, as if they had all been waiting for this moment. Jack's heart raced as he glanced around, taking in the odd expressions on their faces. They all seemed calm, as if they had found the answers he was searching for. But the silence in the room felt unnatural, like they were all waiting for something that would unfold in its own time. Victor's voice broke the stillness again. "Now we begin. The first step is simple, Jack. It is to face the shadows within yourself. Only by acknowledging the darkness inside can you truly begin to ascend beyond it." Jack felt a cold shiver race down his spine. The words, though soothing, carried a weight that seemed to settle in his chest, suffocating him. "Tonight, we begin your journey," Victor continued, his eyes locking with Jack's. "Tonight, you will face what you have avoided. You will confront the grief that has haunted you and let it guide you toward the light." Jack sat in silence, feeling the tension of the room wrap around him like a suffocating fog. The Circle of Ascension was not what he had expected, but it was exactly what he needed. There was no turning back now. He was already too deep to retreat, and the promise of healing, of transcendence, was too enticing to resist. The lights in the room dimmed, and for a moment, the air felt still, thick with the weight of unseen eyes. Jack's heart beat faster, a sense of unease creeping over him, as he prepared to take the first step on a path that would change everything. And in the silence that followed, he knew one thing for certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. Chapter 1. The Invitation continued. The room was suffocatingly quiet, and the only sound that filled the air was the slow, rhythmic ticking of an old clock perched high on the wall. Jack's breath quickened, the anticipation building as Victor Blackwood stood before him, his sharp, unwavering gaze never leaving his face. There was something in the air, something heavy, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the secrets of generations past. Jack could feel it, the oppressive weight of history pressing down on him, the feeling that he had stepped into something far beyond his understanding. Something ancient. Victor's lips parted, his voice smooth as silk. but carrying an unmistakable edge. "Before we begin," he said, "I want you to understand what you're about to do." Jack swallowed hard, his heart thudding in his chest. His palms were slick with sweat, and yet he couldn't bring himself to look away. There was something magnetic about the man, something he couldn't explain. Maybe it was the way Victor spoke, so certain, so confident, as if he knew things that Jack didn't. Things that made him feel like a mere pawn in some game far larger than he had ever imagined. "The path you are about to walk," Victor continued, his voice low and deliberate, "is not one for the faint of heart. It requires strength, resilience, and above all, a willingness to confront the parts of yourself you have buried deep. Those parts that you've tried to forget." Jack's pulse raced. The grief, the anger, the haunting memories. He had buried them all deep within himself, shoving them into the darkest corners of his mind. He had thought he could move on, could bury the pain and pretend that he was fine. But now, faced with this invitation, he knew he couldn't keep running. Victor's voice cut through his thoughts. "You came here because you wanted healing. You wanted answers. But healing, Jack, doesn't come without sacrifice. It requires you to face what you fear the most, to unlock the doors that have been sealed within you." Jack opened his mouth to speak, to ask what exactly that meant, but Victor raised a hand, silencing him before he could utter a word. "No questions. Not yet. All will be revealed in time." A cold shiver ran down Jack's spine. He had come here seeking something: peace, solace, release from the unbearable grief that had been gnawing at his soul. But this felt like something darker, something more profound than he had anticipated. Victor turned and motioned for Jack to follow him. The room seemed to shift around them, as though the very space was folding in on itself, guiding them toward the unknown. Jack's legs felt heavy, and for the first time in his life, he felt the distinct sensation of walking into a place where the rules of reality no longer applied. "This way," Victor said, his voice leading Jack down a long corridor, the flickering candlelight casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. "Tonight, we will begin the first of many steps." Jack nodded, his throat tight, but no words came. His feet moved on their own, as if pulled by some invisible force. He tried to steel himself, tried to summon the courage to ask what this was all about, but the words remained lodged in his throat. Instead, he walked in silence, each step taking him deeper into the labyrinthine halls of Old Willow Manor. They reached a large oak door at the end of the corridor, its surface marked with intricate carvings that seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. The door was old, the wood dark and worn, yet there was a sense of grandeur about it. It felt as though they were standing at the threshold of something ancient, something sacred. Victor placed a hand on the door, and it creaked open with a groan that echoed through the empty hallway. The room beyond was dark, save for a single light in the center of the room that illuminated a small, circular table. At the table sat several figures, all cloaked in black, their faces obscured by shadow. Jack's heart skipped a beat as his eyes scanned the faces around him, but none of them spoke. They simply sat, waiting. Victor motioned for Jack to sit, and Jack did so without hesitation, the chair cold beneath him. As he settled into the seat, the air seemed to thicken, the silence wrapping around him like a heavy blanket. He could feel the weight of the others' eyes on him, though he could not see their faces. "You've taken the first step," Victor's voice came from behind him, low and measured. "And now you will begin your initiation." Jack's mouth went dry, his pulse quickening again. "Initiation?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Yes," Victor answered, his tone almost amused. "In this room, you will learn the first lesson. A lesson that will change you forever." For a moment, there was only silence. The figures around the table remained motionless, and Jack felt his skin crawl as the oppressive atmosphere grew thicker. Victor's footsteps echoed through the room as he moved around the table, his voice lowering as he spoke. "There is a door inside of you, Jack. A door that holds all of your pain, your loss, your regret. For far too long, you have kept it locked, buried beneath layers of denial. But tonight, that door will open, and you will step through it." Jack's breath caught in his throat. The words seemed to hang in the air like smoke, curling around his mind. Was this some kind of psychological trick? A mind game designed to break him further? You must be prepared, Victor continued, his voice growing more insistent. Once the door is opened, there is no turning back. You will see what you have refused to acknowledge, and you will feel it, Jack. You will feel every moment of grief, every lost heartbeat, every ounce of pain you've tried to suppress. Jack's chest tightened. This was not what he had imagined. He had thought that he would find healing, not this dark, unyielding promise of torment. But as he looked around at the cloaked figures, he realized that there was no escape. Not now. Not when he had already crossed the threshold. Victor's hand settled gently on his shoulder, grounding him in the moment. Trust the process, Jack. Trust that what you are about to experience will bring you the clarity you seek. Before Jack could respond, the air in the room shifted, the temperature dropped, and the faint flickering of the light seemed to grow more erratic. He turned his head, noticing the strange symbols etched into the walls. Symbols that now seemed to glow faintly, casting unsettling shadows across the room. It was then that the first figure at the table spoke. Their voice was soft, almost a whisper, but the words cut through the silence with an unnatural clarity. Let us begin. With those words, everything around Jack seemed to blur, and for a brief moment, he felt as though he was falling, tumbling through space. His vision darkened, and a deep, haunting voice echoed in his mind, a voice that was not his own. Face your truth, Jack Morrison. The darkness closed in around him, swallowing him whole. And the cold, harsh light of the room returned in an instant, and Jack found himself sitting back in the chair, his heart racing. The figures around the table were still there, their faces hidden beneath the shadows of their hoods. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. His chest felt tight, his breath ragged. He had felt something otherworldly, something deeply unsettling. But what was it? What had just happened? Was it a hallucination? Or was it something else entirely? Victor stood before him, his expression unreadable. You have crossed the first threshold, Jack. The door inside you has been opened. The darkness will no longer remain hidden. But remember, this is only the beginning. There are many more doors to open, many more truths to face. Jack's head spun, his thoughts a blur. He felt as if he had just woken from a nightmare, but the nightmare was still alive, still lingering in the corners of his mind. He wasn't sure what to feel, relief, fear, or something more profound. Victor's voice pierced the silence again. Your journey has just begun. Are you ready for what comes next? Jack swallowed hard, his heart thumping in his chest. He wasn't sure if he was ready, but there was no turning back now. Yes, he whispered, his voice trembling but resolute. And with that, the second step of his journey began. Chapter 2. The Depths of Truth. The room was unnervingly silent, save for the soft murmur of distant whispers that Jack could not place. The shadows seemed to grow longer as the candlelight flickered, casting grotesque shapes upon the walls. Each movement of the flame seemed to create a reflection of something dark, something just out of reach. A silhouette, a form, maybe even a face, that only existed when Jack dared to glance away. Victor's words echoed in Jack's mind like a hymn from an old, forgotten ritual. There are many more doors to open, many more truths to face. Jack had thought he was prepared. He had thought that confronting his past, the memories of his mother's death, his father's cold indifference, the years of numbness and grief, would be difficult, but surmountable. After all, he had carried them for so long. What more could they do to him? But the air in the room had changed. The door inside him, the one Victor had spoken of, had creaked open, and Jack could feel something stirring beneath the surface. It wasn't just the past he had hidden. It was something darker, something far more primal and dangerous than he had ever imagined. Victor's figure loomed like a spectre at the head of the room. He had not yet spoken, but his presence was like a pull, a gravitational force that seemed to hold Jack in place. His sharp eyes glimmered with an unsettling calm, as if he were the only one who understood what was to come. A soft rustling came from behind Jack, and he stiffened. He turned, half expecting to find one of the cloaked figures moving. But when he glanced over his shoulder, all he saw was the same dark expanse of the room. The shadows seemed to stretch even further now, and the corners of his vision began to dance with shapes, flashes of motion that felt like more than just tricks of the light. Victor stepped forward slowly, his voice low and deliberate. "You must understand, Jack. The truth is not a singular thing. It is layered, buried under years of denial and self-deception. You may have thought you knew what haunted you, but you haven't even begun to uncover the surface." Jack's breath caught in his throat. The room felt colder now, as if the very temperature had dropped with Victor's words. His instincts screamed at him to leave, to run as far and as fast as he could, but his legs refused to obey. Instead, he remained in the chair, rooted to the spot as the shadows seemed to grow closer, pressing in on him. Victor's hand reached out, hovering just above Jack's shoulder. "You're already feeling it, aren't you? The weight of what's hidden inside. It's waking up, clawing its way to the surface. It will not be contained." Jack wanted to speak, to protest, but the words died in his throat. It was as if the air itself had thickened, compressing his chest with a pressure that made it hard to breathe. He could feel his pulse hammering in his temples, the frantic beat echoing in his ears, louder and louder. Without warning, the room seemed to shift. The walls seemed to fold in on themselves, contracting until the space around Jack grew impossibly narrow. The faces of the cloaked figures around him became distorted, their features melting like wax under the intense heat of an unseen fire. Their eyes were the only thing that remained clear, wide, unblinking, and filled with a strange, insatiable hunger. Jack struggled to stand, but his body refused to obey. His vision blurred, and the world seemed to tilt violently to one side, pulling him toward something. The floor, a dark pit that had suddenly opened beneath him. The whispers grew louder, coalescing into an unintelligible cacophony of voices. He could hear them now clearly. Mournful wails, hollow laughter, the crackling of something burning. Something ancient. Victor's voice sliced through the noise. "The first truth, Jack, is that nothing is ever truly gone. The things you've buried, the pain, the guilt, the rage, they never leave you. They only wait, and when you open the door, they return." The room dissolved into darkness, and Jack felt a weightless sensation, as if he was floating in the void. He couldn't tell where the floor was, where the walls ended. There was no ground, no ceiling, just a vast emptiness that stretched infinitely in all directions. And then he heard it. A soft sound at first, like the faintest brush of air across skin, but then it grew louder, more distinct. A voice. It wasn't Victor's voice, but Jack knew the words all the same. "Jack!" It came again, this time more insistent, more real. His name echoed in the vastness, as if the very emptiness itself had a voice. The darkness around him seemed to pulse, as though the air itself was alive, feeding off the sound of his name. Jack tried to scream, but the words caught in his throat. He opened his mouth, but no sound came. The silence was deafening, crushing, suffocating. His heart raced as the darkness closed in, and a cold hand seemed to press against his chest. The whispers returned, but now they were not just whispers. They were voices, real voices. His mother's voice, his father's, a chorus of figures from his past, all speaking at once, all calling out to him. "Jack, you never let us go." He felt the weight of their words, like stones pressing against his chest, suffocating him. His breath grew ragged, each inhale a struggle against the invisible pressure that surrounded him. The voice of his mother echoed once more, clearer now, more distinct. "You locked us away, Jack. You locked us inside. And now you must face us." Jack's eyes snapped open. The cold, heavy weight on his chest was gone, but the feeling lingered like a cold ache deep in his bones. His hands shook violently as he gripped the arms of the chair, trying to steady himself. He could feel his heart pounding against his ribcage, the echo of the voices still reverberating in his mind. Victor stood in front of him now, his face still obscured by shadow, but his expression unreadable. "You've seen it, haven't you? The truth you've hidden. The door inside you has opened, and now the memories flood in." Jack tried to speak, but the words felt foreign on his tongue. The images, the voices, they were all swirling in his mind, too fast, too much to process. Victor leaned in closer, his voice low, almost a whisper. But this is only the beginning. There are many more doors, Jack. Many more truths you must face. The air felt charged, as though something enormous was just waiting to break through the surface. Jack couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. His mind was a swirling vortex of memories, each one more painful than the last. "You're not done yet," Victor said, his voice steady and calm. "You've just begun to unlock the doors inside. There are many more layers, many more faces, many more truths that have been buried for far too long." Jack's mind reeled. What was this? What had he gotten himself into? The horror of it all was almost too much to bear, but even as he struggled to piece together his fragmented thoughts, he knew one thing. There was no turning back now. Victor's hand settled gently on his shoulder, grounding him, yet sending a shock of cold straight through his spine. "This will be your salvation, Jack, or your damnation, but you must keep going." Jack closed his eyes, trying to steady his racing heart. He was no longer sure of what was real, what was illusion. The line between them had blurred beyond recognition. "The second door will open soon," Victor whispered. "Are you ready?" Jack didn't know if he was ready. He didn't know if he would ever be ready. But he couldn't stop now. Not when the darkness was already inside him. Chapter 3. Beneath the Surface. Jack woke to the faint, persistent hum of static. It crawled beneath his skin. A constant pressure, like 1,000 whispering voices scraping against the walls of his mind. For a moment, he wondered if he had been dreaming, if the darkness that had consumed him was nothing more than a figment of his restless imagination. But as he opened his eyes, the cold reality settled around him. He was still in the chair, the same room, the same shadows. But now the air was different, thicker, heavier. It clung to him like a second skin, each breath a struggle against the suffocating atmosphere. The walls, once just dark silhouettes, now seemed to be breathing in time with him. Their surfaces pulsed with a rhythm, as though something inside the very structure of the room was alive, shifting, waiting. Victor stood nearby, his presence as unsettling as it had been before. But now there was something more, something intangible hanging between them. The corners of Victor's mouth twitched upward in the faintest of smiles, a smile that seemed to hide something darker, something ancient. Jack tried to move, but his body felt weighted, bound to the chair as if invisible ropes had coiled around his limbs. His heart pounded in his chest, the sound a steady, insistent drumbeat that reverberated through his entire being. Every pulse felt like a countdown, a slow, unrelenting march towards something inevitable. Victor's voice cut through the silence, smooth and cold. "The second door, Jack. It opens now." The words sent a chill racing down Jack's spine. He didn't know how Victor could sense it, the way his own body seemed to be resisting, trying to cling to whatever fragments of control it still had. But there was no denying the truth of Victor's statement. The air had shifted again, like the atmosphere had just opened up to something deeper, something far darker. Jack's vision blurred as a low, guttural sound echoed in the room, a noise like the scraping of metal on stone. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but as it grew louder, the walls seemed to tremble in response. His pulse quickened. This was not just a sensation of fear. This was something else, something much older, something that had been dormant far too long. Suddenly the temperature dropped, a sharp, biting cold that sliced through the thick air like a knife. The room seemed to grow impossibly larger, the shadows stretching farther, reaching toward him, pulling at his soul like a tide he couldn't escape. "Do you remember the door, Jack?" Victor's voice was almost a whisper now, the words curling around Jack's mind like smoke. "The one you closed long ago, the one you thought you could forget." Jack's mind recoiled. The door, the one Victor had mentioned in passing, as though it were a simple concept. But Jack knew better now. He had already opened one door, and it had cracked open something far more dangerous than he had anticipated. The memories had come rushing back, fractured, violent and raw. They had been locked away for so long, buried so deep beneath the layers of time, that he hadn't known they could resurface. But now, those memories were awakening. And the door? It wasn't just a metaphor, it was real, a tangible, terrifying thing that lay just beneath the surface of his consciousness, waiting to break free. Victor stepped forward, his movements deliberate, as though he were orchestrating the very space around him. The truth is a reflection, Jack, and when you stare too long into it, it begins to stare back. You've seen what you buried. But what happens when the mirror cracks? Before Jack could respond, the floor beneath him shifted. The cold seeped deeper, sinking into his bones, twisting and knotting his thoughts. He could feel something crawling beneath the floorboards, scraping at the wood, searching for a way to break free. The hum of static grew louder, more distorted, as the darkness in the room thickened. Jack's eyes darted from one shadow to the next, but the more he searched, the less certain he became of what he was seeing. The room itself seemed to warp and distort, as though the very laws of reality were being bent, twisted, reshaped. "You've opened the second door, Jack," Victor said again, his voice low and implacable. "And now the truth will come for you. It always does. And when it does, it takes everything. Everything you thought you knew. Everything you thought you had." Jack's heart raced, the pressure building to a suffocating intensity. He tried to stand, to move, but his legs refused to cooperate. His body felt like a foreign thing, a shell that no longer belonged to him. Every movement was slow, deliberate, as if the world itself was holding him in place, keeping him from escaping whatever was about to unfold. Victor's figure seemed to dissolve into the shadows, his form becoming less distinct as the room darkened further. "You cannot escape this, Jack. Not now, not when the doors are already open." And then, just as Jack thought he could bear no more, the room split open. It wasn't a physical split, not in the way he would have expected. No, it was as though the very fabric of the room had torn apart, like the seams of reality itself were coming undone. And through that rift came the thing that had been waiting for so long. A figure stepped through the darkness, its form vague at first, but becoming more defined with each passing second. Jack's breath caught in his throat as he recognized it. Something twisted, grotesque, but undeniably familiar. It was the thing from his past, the thing he had thought was long gone, locked away in the deepest part of his mind. It was his mother. But not the way he remembered her. The woman who now stood before him was not the gentle, loving figure from his childhood. She was something monstrous, something born from the depths of his own subconscious. Her eyes, once kind and warm, were now hollow, black pits that seemed to consume all light. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over her bones, like some sort of grotesque marionette. Her mouth curled into a smile, but it was wrong, contorted, jagged, and unnatural. "Jack!" Her voice was a low, rasping hiss, as if it had not spoken in years. "Did you think you could escape me?" Jack recoiled, his body trembling with an instinctual fear that he could not control. But there was nowhere to run, no escape from the nightmare that had unfolded before him. Victor's voice broke through the chaos, smooth and cold. "This is the truth, Jack, the one you tried to bury, the one you thought would never find its way back. But the truth doesn't die, Jack. It waits. And now it's come for you." Jack could feel the walls closing in again, the weight of the past pressing down on him. His mother's figure moved toward him, her steps slow but inevitable, each one echoing through the room with a chilling finality. Her hands reached out, her fingers impossibly long, her nails like claws, scraping against the air itself. Jack tried to speak, but his voice failed him. The words were trapped in his throat, suffocating him. And then, as his mother's fingers brushed against his face, everything went black. Chapter 4. The Return of the Forgotten. The room, once enveloped in total darkness, was now pierced by a dim, ethereal light. It was not the light of a bulb or a lamp. No, it was the kind of light that seemed to crawl from the very corners of the room, gathering in small pools, as though it were alive, writhing in anticipation. It pulsed with a slow rhythm, a heartbeat that resonated with something far older than the walls surrounding Jack. His mother's twisted form still hovered near him, her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that was both hypnotic and paralyzing. The skin stretched taut across her skeletal face, as if it had been pulled from the very marrow of her bones. And her mouth, God, her mouth, twisted into that awful grin. It was the smile of someone who had never known love, only the hunger that would never be sated. Jack wanted to scream, to fight, but his body betrayed him. His limbs felt weighted, as though they were submerged in thick, viscous liquid. Every attempt to move, to break free from the paralysis, met with failure. His chest tightened as he gasped for breath, but the air was thick and suffocating, choked with the scent of something foul, something ancient. "Jack!" The voice, a rasping hiss, slithered through the room, curling around him like smoke. "Do you remember me?" Her words burned like acid on his skin. The memories surged forward, violent and uncontrollable. The face of the woman he had once known as his mother twisted in his mind. Her soft laughter, her gentle touch, her eyes that once held the warmth of a mother's love. It all shattered now, replaced by the grotesque vision before him. He could feel his pulse in his ears, the sound deafening. The vision before him, his mother, no, this thing, leaned closer, her breath rancid and thick, curling in the air like the stench of death itself. "You thought you could forget me, didn't you?" Her voice was low and filled with malice. "You thought you could bury me. But I never left, Jack. I was always with you, always watching, waiting." The walls seemed to close in around him, as if the room itself was suffocating him, pulling the air out of his lungs. He could feel the weight of years, decades, pressing against him, crushing him beneath their unrelenting force. He wanted to look away, to escape, but the eyes of the creature before him held him fast. His mind screamed for release, but his body refused to obey. Every breath, every heartbeat only made it worse. Her fingers, long and twisted, reached out toward his face. Jack's instinct told him to flinch, to pull away, but his body remained motionless, as though it were no longer his to command. His skin crawled as her cold, bony fingers grazed his cheek. It felt like ice, like the touch of death itself. "You were never meant to escape," the thing whispered, its voice now full of a terrible satisfaction. "You were always mine, Jack, and now you will remember. You will remember everything." The shadows in the room seemed to stir, writhing as if alive. They stretched toward him, reaching with fingers of darkness, curling around his arms, his legs, pulling him deeper into their embrace. And then the room itself shifted. The walls, once solid and unyielding, began to dissolve into a thick fog, swallowing the space until Jack could see nothing at all. In the darkness, Jack felt his consciousness slipping. Memories began to surface, jagged and fractured, like shards of glass embedded in his mind. He saw flashes, his childhood home, the warmth of his mother's smile, the smell of freshly baked bread, the sound of laughter echoing through the house. But then, the images twisted, like the unraveling of a thread. "It was never real," the voice rasped. "The love, the care, the protection, it was all a lie." And then Jack remembered. The memories that had been buried for so long came crashing back like a flood. Too many to process, too many to make sense of. He saw the flashes of pain, of screams that had echoed through his home long before the darkness had taken root. He saw his mother's face, this thing that had once been his mother, her eyes filled not with love, but with hunger, with something monstrous that had never been fully extinguished. "You thought I died, Jack," the thing said, its voice now full of rage. "But I never died. I was only sleeping. And now, Jack, you will join me, forever." Jack's body, still bound by invisible chains, was dragged through the fog, deeper into the heart of the darkness. He could feel it now, the pulse beneath the ground, the thrum of something ancient, something evil. It was as if the world around him was shifting, cracking, coming undone. The very fabric of reality seemed to tear at the seams. The air grew colder still, until it felt like he was suffocating in ice. His breath came in shallow gasps, his chest constricting, his heart pounding in his throat. But through it all, he could hear the thing, his mother, laughing. It was a sound that echoed through the darkness, a twisted, guttural laugh that seemed to reverberate in every corner of his mind. The walls shook with its intensity, and Jack's world seemed to fracture under the weight of it. "You cannot run from me, Jack," the voice sneered. "You never could. You're just like me. You've always been just like me." The ground beneath him began to tremble, and Jack felt something stirring in the depths below. A force, ancient and powerful, clawing its way to the surface. His mind reeled as the realization hit him. This wasn't just about his mother. This wasn't just about his past. This was about something much older, something that had been waiting for him, watching him all this time. And now, it was rising. His breath came in ragged gasps as the shadows surged around him, pulling at his limbs, twisting his thoughts. He was being drawn into the heart of this nightmare, into the darkness that had always been there, waiting for him to return. He could hear the whispers now, growing louder, filling his head with voices he couldn't understand. They spoke in tongues, in languages that made his skin crawl, words that made his teeth grind and his blood run cold. "You will never leave this place, Jack," the thing's voice echoed in his mind. "You belong to me now, to us." The darkness closed in. His body was no longer his own. His mind was a tangle of half-formed thoughts, fragments of memories that no longer made sense. And in the distance he could hear the laughter, the horrible, twisted laughter of his mother, and something else. Something darker. The ground beneath him cracked, splitting wide open. And from the depths, something reached up. Something alive. Something that had been waiting, biding its time. The last thing Jack saw before the world swallowed him whole was the thing that had once been his mother, smiling that same awful smile. Chapter 5. The hollow whisper of the past. Jack awoke, but not in the way one wakes from a dream. His eyes fluttered open to a world that felt wrong. It was as though the veil between the living and the dead had been pulled back just enough for him to glimpse the darkness that lay beyond. The air was thick, heavy with an almost palpable weight, as though the room itself was pressing in on him. The cold crept into his bones, making him shiver despite the absence of any breeze. He was no longer in the place he had been moments before. The oppressive shadows, the maddening whispers, the thing that had once been his mother. All of that had vanished, as if it had never existed. But the chill remained. He tried to move, but his limbs were sluggish, uncooperative, as though they had been drained of their vitality. The floor beneath him was hard, cold, and uneven. His fingers brushed against it, feeling the coarse texture of wood, splintered and old. Slowly, his mind began to clear, if only a little. He could hear his own breath, shallow and quick, but the sound was muffled, as though the world around him was consuming the very essence of sound itself. He tried to speak, but his voice, when it finally broke free, was a hoarse whisper, barely a thread in the oppressive silence. "Where am I?" he muttered. But even his words seemed to dissolve into the air, swallowed up by the suffocating atmosphere. He pushed himself up, wincing as his legs protested the movement. His eyes darted around the room, desperate to make sense of his surroundings. The space was small, dimly lit by an overhead light that flickered sporadically, casting long shadows on the walls. Everything about it felt decayed, forgotten, like a place long abandoned. The wallpaper was peeling in places. The color faded to a sickly yellow. There was a faint smell in the air, the stench of mildew and something else, something older, something far worse. Jack's heart skipped a beat when he realized he wasn't alone. In the corner of the room, a figure stood motionless, watching him. At first, he thought it might be another hallucination, another trick of the mind that had been twisted by fear. But no, this presence was real. It was a person, or at least what had once been a person. The figure was a man, but there was something wrong with him, something out of place. He was tall, impossibly so, with arms that seemed too long for his body. His face was gaunt, stretched too thin, with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light, as if they were lit from within. His mouth hung slightly open, as though he was waiting for something, or someone. His clothes were ragged, torn at the edges, as though they had been worn for years, perhaps decades. Jack froze, his breath caught in his throat. There was a faint pull in the air, something magnetic, something that called to him. The man's gaze seemed to pierce through him, locking onto him with the intensity that made his skin crawl. The figure took a step forward. The sound of his footfall was heavy, deliberate. The floorboards creaked under the weight of his presence, a sound that reverberated in the silence. Jack's instincts screamed at him to run, to escape. But his body refused to cooperate, still sluggish, still trapped in some unseen force. The man smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. It was twisted, sickening, as though the muscles in his face were being stretched beyond their capacity. "You're finally awake," the man's voice rasped. It sounded like dry leaves crunching underfoot, the words thick and brittle. Jack's eyes widened. He had heard that voice before. It was the same voice from his dreams. No, nightmares. That voice had called to him from the depths of his subconscious, urging him to remember, to come home. "Who are you?" Jack managed to force the words out, his throat dry, his voice trembling. The man did not answer immediately. Instead, he took another step forward, his movements slow and deliberate. The air seemed to thicken with each inch he closed, wrapping around Jack like a vice. He could feel his pulse quicken, his heart hammering in his chest. It was as though the room itself was alive, watching him, waiting for him to make a move. "Do you not remember?" the man said, his voice low and guttural. "How could you forget? You were part of this once, just like me, just like all of us." The words hit Jack like a physical blow. He staggered back, his head spinning. His mind reeled. He knew the man was speaking the truth. There were fragments of memories, snippets, images, fleeting flashes that had begun to surface in the dark corners of his mind, but they were too disjointed to make sense of. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the voice, trying to push the memories away. But they came regardless. He saw a child, a young boy, barely 10 years old, standing in front of a crumbling house. His own house, a house that had once been full of laughter, of warmth, of life. But now it was nothing more than a rotting shell. The boy turned to look at him, and in his eyes Jack saw something familiar, a reflection of his own soul. There was a sadness there, a deep unspoken grief. And then the boy spoke. "You abandoned us," the boy's voice echoed in his mind. "You left us to die." Jack's stomach churned. He staggered forward, his head swimming with confusion. He reached out to steady himself against the wall, his hand brushing against the peeling wallpaper. The sensation sent a jolt of revulsion through him. The wall was wet, slick with moisture. His fingers trembled as they traced the damp surface. It felt wrong, as though the wall itself were alive, pulsing beneath his touch. "You abandoned us," the voice repeated, and Jack's knees buckled beneath him. He collapsed to the floor, his head spinning. The figure in the corner stepped closer. "Do you remember now, Jack?" he asked, his tone laced with something like mockery. "The things you left behind, the ones you thought were dead?" Jack gasped, struggling to stand. His thoughts were fractured, shattered pieces of a broken past that he could no longer put together. His mother, the house, the boy, the memories were slipping through his fingers like sand. "You think you escaped," the man said, his voice now a hiss. "But you were never meant to escape, Jack. The darkness doesn't let go. It never lets go." Jack's head jerked back as the room seemed to shift, warp, and twist around him. The walls bent, the floor rippled, and the shadows in the corners of the room stretched, growing long and serpentine. The man's face was now inches from Jack's. His eyes, those glowing, hollow eyes, were full of nothing but hunger. "You're back now," the man whispered, his breath cold against Jack's ear. "And we will never leave you again." The room began to close in around Jack. The walls pressed in. The shadows whispered his name, and the stench of decay filled the air. His body was frozen in place, and the darkness wrapped itself around him like a shroud. He could feel the coldness seeping into his very bones, draining the warmth from his soul. He was trapped. The man smiled again. "Welcome home, Jack." Chapter 6. The echoes of the forgotten. The cold had never left Jack. It had settled into his bones, lodged deep inside his skin, and no matter how much he tried to shake it, it clung to him. Even as he stumbled through the narrow hallway of what had once been his home, before everything changed, the chill seemed to follow him, like an unseen spectre, feeding off his confusion and fear. The walls around him were a patchwork of decay, the wallpaper peeling like the skin of something that had long since died. The air was thick, heavy with mildew, but underneath it, there was something older, something sour, almost metallic, like the taste of blood on the back of his tongue. Jack swallowed hard, trying to push the taste away, but it lingered, biting at his senses. He had come back here for answers. There was no other reason for it. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to turn away, to leave, but the pull was too strong. It was as if the house itself had called to him, drawing him back to the place where everything had begun and ended. As he walked deeper into the house, the floor creaked beneath him. Each step echoed, a hollow sound that reverberated in the silence. The shadows were thick here, curling and shifting in the corners, like they had a life of their own. The familiar warmth of the house, the smells of cooking meals, and the sound of laughter were long gone. What remained was a quiet void, a space where something had died, but not completely. Something had changed. Jack reached the doorway of the living room. It was a place he had once spent countless hours with his family. Before, now, it was almost unrecognizable. The once familiar furniture was overturned, its upholstery torn and stained. The curtains, once pristine, were now shredded, hanging like tattered flags of despair. The room seemed to be holding its breath, as if waiting for him to say something, to do something. He stood there for a long moment, just staring, trying to make sense of the wreckage. His hands trembled at his sides, the fear gnawing at his insides like a hungry beast. It wasn't just the house that had changed. It was him too. Every time he tried to reach for a memory, it slipped through his fingers, vanishing like smoke. The more he tried to hold on to the past, the more it faded. A whisper stirred in the air. Soft at first, like the rustling of leaves, but then louder, sharper, clearer. Jack's breath caught in his throat as the whisper grew, filling the room with words he couldn't understand, words that seemed to echo in his mind. He looked around, his heart pounding. The room was empty, there was no one there, and yet the voice continued, growing louder with each passing second. "You've come back, but you never should have." Jack spun around, his eyes wide, searching the room for the source of the voice. There was nothing, only the silence. And yet, the words lingered in the air, wrapping around him, choking him. He felt a sudden pressure against his chest, as though the walls themselves were closing in on him. The air grew thick, suffocating. He could barely breathe, his lungs burning with the weight of the atmosphere. His mind raced, trying to comprehend what was happening. Was it real? Was this some kind of hallucination? Was he losing his mind? He reached out to steady himself, his hand brushing against the back of the couch. The fabric was damp, as though something had spilled across it. The texture felt strange, unsettling, like skin, soft and yet unnaturally slick. He recoiled, pulling his hand away as a shiver ran down his spine. Then the silence broke. A sharp, agonizing scream sliced through the air, its source indistinguishable. Jack froze, his heart racing, his ears ringing with the sound. The scream was filled with such raw pain that it felt like it was coming from his own throat. It was a scream of agony, of loss, a scream that spoke of something far worse than death, a scream that begged for release. "Mom!" The word escaped his lips before he could stop it. His voice was hoarse, almost foreign to him, as if it didn't belong to his own body. But the response that came was not the voice he had hoped for. It was low, guttural, the kind of sound that only comes from deep within the earth. A growl, almost, but with the unmistakable sound of something ancient, something alive. Jack turned, his body shaking uncontrollably, his breath coming in shallow gasps. There, in the corner of the room, was a figure. It was hunched, almost skeletal, its limbs elongated and twisted in unnatural angles. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were two glowing orbs, like deep pits of blackness, staring straight through him. The figure was draped in what looked like tattered remnants of clothing, scraps that barely clung to its withered form. It moved toward him slowly, its steps deliberate, each one sending a ripple of terror through the air. Jack could hear the wet, sucking sound of its movements, as though its feet were sinking into the rotting floor. He stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest, but his feet wouldn't move. It was as if they were glued to the spot. His breath hitched as the figure drew closer. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and stretched tight over its bones. Jack could see the veins beneath it, black and swollen, pulsing with a sickly rhythm. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. His throat was dry, his voice lost in the overwhelming pressure that surrounded him. The figure stopped just inches from him. Jack could feel the cold radiating from its body, the stench of decay overwhelming his senses. He gagged, struggling to breathe, but all he could inhale was the foul odor of something that had been dead for far too long. And then, in a voice that was not its own, the figure spoke. "You came back. You never should have." The words were a jagged whisper, like the grinding of stones against each other, and yet they cut deep into Jack's soul. He tried to pull away, to break free, but it was as if invisible chains held him in place. "You've awakened what was sleeping," the figure continued, its voice now a low rasp, as though it were speaking from the very depths of the earth. "And now, you'll never leave." The words echoed in Jack's mind, resonating with a truth that he couldn't quite grasp. It was as though the house itself were alive, its heart beating in time with his own. And the figure, it wasn't just a thing. It was a part of this place, a manifestation of something older than the house, older than anything Jack had ever known. His mind reeled. There was no escape. "This is where it all ends," the figure hissed, its eyes narrowing, glowing brighter. "This is where you belong." The weight of the words pressed down on Jack like 1,000-ton stone. His chest tightened, and his vision blurred. The house was swallowing him whole, its darkness pulling him into its depths, into something worse than death. There was no way out. The walls were closing in, the shadows were growing, and the figure, whatever it was the gatekeeper. Suddenly, everything went cold. So cold that Jack could feel his bones crack from the pressure. The darkness enveloped him, suffocating him, and he could hear the whisper of something ancient, something that had been waiting for him all along. "It's too late now, Jack." And then there was nothing. No sound, no movement, only the heavy silence of the house, a silence that spoke of something waiting, something eternal. And in that silence, Jack realized the terrible truth. He was home. Chapter 6. The Echoes of the Forgotten, Part 2. The darkness pressed in on Jack, squeezing the very air from his lungs. He could barely breathe. It was as if the house itself were inhaling, drawing in all the light, all the warmth, until it was nothing but cold, suffocating shadows. And yet the figure before him, its hollow, glowing eyes locked onto him with predatory intensity, was not the only thing that haunted this place. No, the house was alive with its own whispers, its own tortured memories, like the lingering spirits of something lost to time. His pulse raced in his ears, louder than the silence of the room. Sweat slicked his palms as he tried to move, to step back, but his feet wouldn't respond. It was as if the floor beneath him had turned to quicksand, pulling him deeper into the nightmare with every second that passed. The air seemed thicker, pressing against his skin, until it felt as though the walls were closing in around him. The house was alive, alive with something ancient, something far beyond his understanding. "You should have stayed away." The figure's voice was no longer a whisper, but a hiss, a terrible guttural sound that echoed through the room like a warning. It moved closer, its limbs creaking as it twisted unnaturally. Its fingers, long, blackened claws, reached for him. Jack recoiled, his heart thudding against his ribs. But the more he pulled away, the closer the creature seemed to get. Suddenly, the air shifted. The temperature dropped even further, and Jack could see his breath in front of him, a fog of vapor in the air. It was as if the house itself was breathing, each exhale a cold gust of despair. The walls seemed to warp and distort, their shapes bending, reshaping as though the house was trying to tell him something, trying to show him something he wasn't meant to see. The floor beneath his feet groaned, the house settling as if it were alive, responding to the weight of his presence. A low hum began to vibrate through the air, almost imperceptible at first, but growing steadily louder until it became a dull roar in his ears. It was the sound of a heartbeat, a deep, pulsing rhythm, slow and methodical, as though the very heart of the house was waking up, responding to the pulse of his fear. Jack staggered back, his feet finally finding purchase on the floor. He had to get out of here. He had to escape, but every instinct in his body screamed that there was no escape. The figure had moved closer, now mere inches from him, its foul breath seeping into the air, hot and putrid. Jack could smell it, the stench of rot, of something long dead and buried. His stomach churned, and his mind screamed at him to run, to get away from this thing before it consumed him. The figure's hand reached out, brushing against his cheek. Its skin was cold, unnaturally cold, like ice, but there was something else. Something worse. There was a familiarity to the touch, a sensation that made Jack's blood run cold. He felt his knees buckle, but he managed to stay upright. The creature's fingers curled around his face, pulling him closer. Its eyes locked onto his, and in that instant, Jack realized. He recognized it. The creature before him wasn't a stranger. No, it was something else. Something that had been with him all along. "Do you remember me, Jack?" the creature whispered. Its voice was a mixture of malice and something far worse. Something that reached deep into Jack's soul, causing his blood to freeze. "Do you remember what you left behind?" Jack's heart slammed against his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The words seemed to wrap around his mind, squeezing tighter and tighter until they felt like a vice. He wanted to speak, to shout, but his throat had gone dry. The creature's presence was overwhelming, suffocating him, and the room seemed to tilt, the walls bending in on him. Suddenly, the house around him began to change. The furniture that had been destroyed, the broken chairs, the overturned tables, seemed to move of their own accord. The pieces of the shattered room shifted, reassembling themselves like a puzzle being put together, but in a twisted, grotesque manner. The walls seemed to pulse, as if they had a life of their own, stretching and contracting in time with the dark rhythm of the house's heartbeat. Jack blinked. The room before him, what was once his living room, had become something entirely different. The walls had begun to warp, twisting into grotesque shapes, like the distorted images in a nightmare. The shattered glass of the windows began to mend itself. Slowly, but surely, the pieces fitting together like shards of broken glass returning to their original form. But the worst part, the shadows, which had once been contained in the corners of the room, now stretched and moved. They slithered like living things, wrapping around the furniture, slinking over the walls like dark, liquid smoke. They seemed to be searching for something, or someone. Jack's pulse quickened. The floor beneath him groaned, and he heard a faint whisper, distant, like a memory trying to claw its way to the surface. "Come home." It was faint at first, like a distant echo, but then the voice grew louder until it reverberated in his mind. The words were clear now. "Come home." Jack stumbled backward, his head spinning. His heart was racing. He could feel the walls closing in, the air getting heavier, thicker. He needed to leave, now. The house had begun to pull him in, its sinister pull dragging him deeper and deeper into its grasp. It wasn't just the creature, the house itself had come alive, feeding off his fear, feeding off his terror. The very ground beneath him seemed to tremble as if in response to the fear that was consuming him. The whispers began again, louder this time. "Come home, Jack." They repeated, a chorus of voices, some familiar, some strange, some gentle, others twisted, almost mocking. "Come home, come home." Jack's vision blurred, the room spinning around him. His stomach twisted with dread. He had to get out. There was no other choice. But as he turned to flee, the door, the one that had once led him to safety, was no longer there. Where the entrance had once been, there was only a wall that had not been there before. It was smooth, featureless, like the face of a dead man. The whispers turned into laughter, dark, mocking, cruel laughter. "You can't leave," the figure hissed, its voice cold and final. "You can't escape, Jack. You are home." The house seemed to breathe, the walls exhaling as if in triumph. The temperature plummeted further, and Jack's breath fogged in front of him. His mind was slipping, consumed by the nightmare, by the house that had waited for him. The fear, the cold. It was too much. It was pulling him under, dragging him into the suffocating depths of the unknown. Jack's mind fractured, splintering, as his vision went black. Chapter 7. The Unraveling. Jack awoke to silence, the kind of silence that suffocates, fills the air with weight, and leaves you questioning whether anything is real at all. For a moment, he thought he might be dead. Perhaps the house had consumed him, like it had promised, but his chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, the cold, dank air pressing against his skin, and his limbs felt oddly heavy, as though weighed down by something invisible, something ancient. The room he found himself in had changed again. It was no longer the familiar living room or the twisted, warped space where he'd last stood. This time, it was a hallway, a long, narrow passage lined with doors that seemed to lead nowhere. They were all closed, their surfaces cracked and warped, as if they had been there for centuries. The wallpaper was peeling, revealing strips of dark, decaying wood beneath, and the faint, musty smell of mildew filled the air. His breath caught in his throat as he took in the sight of the place. This was not the house he remembered. It was something else entirely. Something older. And then, as if the house were answering his thoughts, the temperature dropped even further. The air grew thick, like smoke curling in from some forgotten corner of the world, settling in his lungs and making his head spin. He could see his breath in front of him, thick and visible in the otherwise stagnant air. Jack pushed himself to his feet, his knees buckling for a moment before he found his balance. He had to move. The urge to run was overwhelming, but the house had become a labyrinth of corridors and rooms that seemed to stretch on forever, disorienting him, pulling him deeper into its dark, eternal heart. Every step he took echoed in the vast silence, a hollow sound that reverberated off the walls, making him feel smaller with each passing second. He tried to steady his breath, to focus. But the house, it wasn't just the oppressive silence, it was the eyes that he felt on him, even when he couldn't see them. The pressure in the air seemed to grow as if invisible watchers were waiting for him to make a mistake, to let his guard down, to succumb to the terror creeping at the edges of his sanity. Something was in the walls, something ancient, something that had been there far longer than the house itself. Jack turned down the hallway, his footsteps faltering as the floor creaked underfoot. The shadows, so thick they seemed to have form, began to move, slithering across the walls, reaching out like fingers eager to touch him. He couldn't breathe. His chest tightened as the darkened figures shifted, pulling his focus into their shifting shapes. One of the doors suddenly creaked open, its hinges groaning in protest. Jack's heart skipped a beat, and he froze, unsure whether to approach or flee. The door was ajar, a dark, yawning gap that beckoned him forward. There was no way around it. The house had already cornered him. He had no choice but to go through. As he stepped closer, the floorboards groaned under his weight, the air thickening with each step. The door opened wider, revealing a room that should not have existed. It was an old study, a dusty, forgotten place, its wooden shelves sagging under the weight of countless old books. The faint smell of ink and parchment lingered in the air, but there was something else, a staleness, like the room had been sealed for decades. In the middle of the room stood a desk, old and battered, covered in a thick layer of dust. Papers were scattered across it, yellowed with age, and an old lamp, its glass shattered, flickered weakly as if struggling to remain lit. The walls were lined with mirrors, hundreds of them. Some were cracked, others tarnished, but all reflected nothing. Nothing but the darkness that seemed to stretch endlessly behind them. Jack stepped into the room, his breath catching in his throat as he walked toward the desk. It felt wrong. This place, this study. The air was too still, the silence too deep, as though the room was holding its breath, waiting for him to do something. He reached out to touch one of the papers on the desk, and as his fingers grazed the brittle edge, a chill ran through him. The paper flapped violently, as if caught by an unseen wind, and Jack jerked his hand back in surprise. His heart pounded in his chest. The room seemed to pulse, like the beating of a heart in the walls, in the mirrors. A low sound, almost imperceptible, whispered through the room, like a voice, like someone speaking just beyond the edge of his hearing. It was so faint that Jack wasn't sure if it was real, or if his mind was playing tricks on him, but then he heard it again. "Help me." The voice was soft, pleading, familiar. His blood ran cold. The words weren't for him. They were for someone else, someone trapped here, just like him. Jack stepped back, his eyes darting around the room. The mirrors. The mirrors were wrong. Their surfaces rippled like water, distorting the reflections. And then he saw it. A figure. No, not a figure, a shape. It was a shadow, shifting and twisting, alive. It moved within the mirror, its form vague, undulating, as if it were caught between worlds. Jack's eyes widened in terror. He could see it now, could see it in the reflections of every mirror, growing, becoming clearer. It was him, but not him. A twisted, contorted version of himself, hollow-eyed and pale, its features grotesque, as if carved by some unseen hand. No, this isn't me. But the figure in the mirror was laughing. A laugh that was not his, a laugh that was wrong. It was the laugh of something that had died long ago, something that had never truly lived, something that had been trapped in this forsaken house for eternity. And yet Jack knew deep in his gut that the thing in the mirror was him. It was the him he had abandoned, the him he had left behind when he first stepped into the house. It knew him. And then the figure in the mirror reached out, its claw-like fingers pressing against the glass, stretching it, distorting the reflection even more. Jack stumbled backward, his pulse pounding in his ears. The room around him began to twist, the walls warping as the mirrors began to shimmer and crack, as if the reflections were shattering, splintering the very fabric of reality. He needed to leave, but the door had disappeared again, swallowed by the darkness of the room. Jack's breath quickened. He could feel it now. The house was alive, its grip tightening around him, dragging him deeper into its maw. The mirrors, the shadows, the whispers, they were all part of it. They were the house. And the house was hungry. He turned, scrambling for any way out, but there was nothing. No escape. The mirrors reflected only the growing horror, the distorted version of himself that was closing in, step by agonizing step. His reflection was coming for him. "Help me." The voice echoed again, a desperate plea, but now it was no longer distant. It was in his ears, surrounding him, suffocating him. Help me, Jack." The voice wasn't just a whisper. It was a scream, rising in pitch, becoming more desperate, more frantic. The mirrors shattered, and the darkness poured in. Chapter 8. The Echoes of the Forgotten. The house had become more than a mere structure. It had become a living entity, a thing that breathed in the shadows and exhaled death. The air was thick, oppressive with the weight of centuries of suffering. Each corner of the house seemed to pull at Jack, like a sinister force tugging on his very soul. The walls had eyes, the floors groaned in agony, and the mirrors, those accursed mirrors, reflected not the present, but the torment of a past Jack was desperately trying to avoid. He could no longer tell how long he had been trapped here, lost in the labyrinthine corridors that twisted and turned in impossible ways. The house had no mercy, no logic. It was alive, hungry, and it knew exactly what he feared most. The last place he remembered entering was the study, the room with the mirrors, where he had seen himself. Not the man he was, but the man he could become, the twisted reflection that grinned back at him with hollow, empty eyes. That version of him, he was certain, was waiting to take his place. But where was he now? He had no idea. The house seemed to shift constantly, opening and closing doors at will, leaving him with no clear path forward. He had followed the whispers down darkened hallways, the soft and agonizing voice calling his name, but now, even that had faded into the distance. The silence was overwhelming, like a blanket smothering him. But it was a silence that felt like it was about to break open at any moment. It was a silence teeming with the echoes of all the things that had happened here. The laughter of children long dead, the screams of those who had met their end in this cursed place, the soft whispers of the house itself calling to him, urging him onward, deeper into its heart. Jack had been running for what felt like hours, days, maybe even longer, but the house had only grown more labyrinthine as he went. The same rooms would appear again and again, their details slightly altered each time, as though the house was bending reality to trap him, to confuse him. No matter how far he went, he always ended up back in the same place, facing the same closed doors, the same mirrors reflecting back his own fear and despair. He was not alone here. There was something with him. Someone. A sound broke the oppressive silence, a soft scraping noise, like fingernails dragging across the floor. Jack's blood ran cold. He froze in place, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound was getting closer. He could hear the faint shuffle of footsteps, dragging, scraping, like something, or someone, was moving through the house with agonizing slowness, unwilling to reveal itself. Then, he saw it. At the end of the hall, just beyond the reach of the flickering light, a shadow moved. It was too fast to be human, too erratic to be anything of this world. It slithered across the floor, shifting in ways that defied logic, as if it were made of smoke or shadows. Jack couldn't breathe. His eyes locked on it, his body frozen in terror. The shadow lingered in the doorway, staring at him. He could feel its eyes on him, though he couldn't see them. The darkness surrounding it seemed to pulse and ripple like the surface of a pool, the faint outline of something twisted and horrid barely visible beneath the surface. "Help me," it whispered, the words so soft and yet so piercing that they seemed to burrow deep into his skull. The voice was unmistakable. It was the same voice that had whispered to him in the mirrors, the same voice that had been calling to him, begging for release. But this time, the voice sounded different. It was no longer pleading. It was demanding. Jack couldn't tear his eyes away from the shadow. He took a step forward, drawn to it like a moth to a flame. He felt something pull at him, like invisible hands gripping his very soul, dragging him forward into the darkness. As he moved closer, the air grew colder, and the shadow stretched farther across the room, twisting into a shape that should not have been possible. It was there, in the corner of his vision, just beyond the edge of his understanding. The room around him seemed to bend and shift, the walls warping like liquid, as though they were alive. Suddenly, the voice spoke again, but this time, it was not alone. The walls around him seemed to come alive with whispers, thousands of voices, pleading, begging, crying out for release. Jack stumbled back, horrified, as the room seemed to close in on him, the darkness pressing against his skin, suffocating him. And then the shadows moved. The figure in the doorway lunged forward, its form shifting and twisting into something horrific. It was not human. It had no face, only a mass of writhing darkness, tendrils of shadow reaching out toward him. Its mouth opened wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and Jack's blood turned to ice. He tried to run, but his legs felt like lead. The walls seemed to stretch and warp around him, trapping him in place as the creature inched closer, its shape growing ever larger, its mouth opening wider. "You cannot escape," the creature hissed, its voice like 1,000 whispers, all clamoring for his attention at once. "You are already ours." The walls around him trembled, and the lights flickered out, plunging the hallway into absolute darkness. Jack stumbled backward, his heart racing in his chest. His breath came in ragged gasps, but no matter how much he tried to scream, no sound escaped his lips. The house was alive, and it was devouring him piece by piece. Suddenly, there was a low groan, and the floor beneath him gave way, a crack opening in the earth like the mouth of some great beast. Jack tried to stop himself, but it was too late. He fell, tumbling into the abyss, the darkness swallowing him whole. He hit the ground with a sickening thud. For a moment, everything was still. His vision was blurry, and his body ached. He could feel the blood rushing in his ears, but there was no sound. Just the oppressive silence of the house, the silence that seemed to stretch out forever. And then he saw it. It was there, beneath him, beneath the floor, beneath the very foundation of the house. It was not a room, not a place. It was a pit, a deep, endless pit, stretching downward into darkness. The shadows in the pit wriggled and shifted, as though something was moving, something alive. Jack tried to move, but his body refused to obey him. He was trapped, caught in the dark maw of the house, unable to escape, unable to understand. And then, with an overwhelming sense of finality, the voice whispered again. But this time, it was not in his head. It was in the very walls. "We are waiting, Jack. We have always been waiting." Chapter 9. Beneath the Surface. The darkness that enveloped Jack seemed to have a life of its own, a silent observer that fed on his fear. His body lay on the cold, uneven ground. Too still, too quiet for comfort. The shadows stretched long and thin, like claws that reached from every corner of the house. His breath, ragged and shallow, echoed in his ears as he lay paralyzed by the nightmare that surrounded him. The pit he had fallen into had no visible end, no bottom that he could perceive. It was as if the very earth itself was an infinite expanse of void, swallowing him whole. He tried to move, to scream, but his body refused to obey. His limbs felt like they were bound by invisible chains, the weight of the air above him pressing down, making every breath harder to draw. His eyes darted, searching for some escape, some sliver of light that could offer him even the smallest glimpse of salvation. But there was nothing, only darkness. The whispering voices, once distant, now filled his mind. They murmured in a language he could not understand, their tones eerie and distorted, as though they came from deep beneath the earth itself. He could feel their presence, a terrible, palpable pressure surrounding him. It was as if the house, the very foundation of the place, was alive, breathing around him, growing, shifting. And then, as if in response to his growing panic, a faint glow appeared in the distance. It was dim, but it pulsed rhythmically, like a heartbeat. It was the only thing in this oppressive void that seemed to offer any direction, any purpose. Instinctively, Jack crawled toward it, his hands scraping against the cold stone floor, feeling the rough texture dig into his skin. Each movement felt unnatural, sluggish, as if something was pulling him back, urging him to stay where he was. But he ignored it, the faint light ahead of him offering a shred of hope, however tenuous. The whispers grew louder as he drew closer to the source of the glow. It was almost as if they were speaking directly to him now. The words were unclear, indecipherable, but the tone was unmistakable, mocking, taunting, delighted by his fear. It felt as though they were circling around him, trapping him in a web of sound that only heightened his sense of dread. As he neared the light, the ground beneath him seemed to shift once more. The once solid earth gave way, crumbling in jagged pieces, as if it had been fractured by some unseen force. Jack stumbled, his foot slipping into the widening gap, his body falling once again, deeper into the black void. For a moment, the light flickered out. Then, just as suddenly, it flared back to life, stronger, more intense, and far closer now. He was no longer alone in this abyss. A figure stood before him, bathed in the eerie light, its shape twisted and indistinct. It was not human. No, it was something far worse, something ancient, something that had been here long before Jack's arrival. He could hear it now, the low growl that rumbled from deep within the figure, a sound that shook him to his core. The air felt charged, thick with the palpable tension of something ancient stirring. The figure's eyes glowed, but they were not eyes like his. They were hollow, empty sockets, devoid of any human emotion. The whispers grew into a crescendo, a cacophony of voices filling his mind, pressing against his skull like 1,000 sharp needles. They spoke of death, of suffering, of the endless torment that awaited him. They told him that he had already crossed the line, that there was no turning back now. Jack tried to scream, but the words caught in his throat. His body was rigid, his muscles locked in place as if by some unseen force. The figure in front of him moved slowly, its movements jerky and unnatural. It was no longer a thing of flesh, but of shadow, a being formed from the very darkness that surrounded them. And then it spoke. "You should not have come," it hissed. Its voice was like sandpaper scraping against his eardrums, its words laced with a malice that was almost palpable. "You are not meant to be here. This place, it does not belong to the living. It belongs to those who never left, those who remain trapped in their own misery." The words felt like an icy hand against Jack's chest, squeezing the life out of him. He could feel the weight of its presence pressing in on him, suffocating him. His mind raced, trying to understand, trying to make sense of what was happening. But there was no sense to be made. There were no answers here, only more questions, more darkness. "This is where you belong," the figure continued, its voice echoing in the chamber like a distorted song. "This is where the lost souls go. You are no different from them. You will stay here, in the dark, for eternity. And the house will feed on your fear, your suffering, until there is nothing left of you but dust. The figure took a step closer, its form growing more distinct, more real with each movement. Jack could see it now, its long skeletal hands reaching out toward him, its fingers elongated, tipped with sharp claws that gleamed in the dim light. It was no longer a shadow, but something far worse, something that had taken on the form of a nightmare. Jack could feel the temperature drop, his breath forming in the air in wisps of white. The cold was unbearable, biting into his skin, seeping into his bones. But it wasn't the cold that terrified him. It was the knowledge that this place, this house, had a will of its own. And it wanted him. It wanted to claim him just as it had claimed all those before him. His body trembled as the figure reached out, its claws grazing his skin. The sensation was electric, but not in any way he had ever known. It was as though his very soul was being touched, the darkness seeping into him, staining him from the inside out. He felt his strength draining away, his will to fight faltering. But then, something snapped. A surge of anger, raw, primal, rushed through him. He would not let this place claim him. Not yet. He was not ready to die. He pushed against the figure, his hands trembling as they gripped its cold, intangible form. He could feel it resisting him, fighting back. But the anger inside him burned brighter, hotter than ever before. He was stronger than this. Stronger than the house. He would not let it take him. The figure screeched, a high-pitched wail that sent waves of agony crashing through his mind. The light around them flickered, its pulse quickening. The house was alive, but Jack was not ready to be consumed. Not yet. With a forceful shove, he pushed the figure back, feeling the coldness retreat as he took a step away from the edge of the abyss. The shadows writhed in protest, but he was resolute. He was not going to be its victim. As he turned to flee, the darkness erupted, swallowing him whole once more. The house was pulling him back, drawing him deeper into its haunted depths. But Jack knew one thing. He would escape. No matter what it took. No matter how long it took. The house might have claimed the others, but it would not claim him. Not today. Chapter 10. The Final Descent. Jack stumbled through the suffocating darkness, his breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. The weight of the house pressed against him from all sides, each wall seemingly closing in, as though the building itself was alive, watching him, waiting for him to falter. His legs shook with exhaustion, his mind a blur of fragmented thoughts. It had been hours, maybe days, since he had first descended into the depths of this nightmarish place. The boundary between reality and madness had long since dissolved, leaving him adrift in a sea of terror and confusion. The whispers had not stopped. They had grown louder, more insistent, and now they seemed to come from every direction. They spoke of things far older than the house, of dark forces that had always existed beneath the surface of the world, waiting for a soul like his to slip into their grasp. They told him of those who had come before him, victims of the house's unyielding hunger. They were trapped here, their screams silenced by time, their bodies reduced to nothing but dust and bones, and soon Jack would join them. The floor beneath his feet groaned in protest as he took another step. The house was shifting, warping, changing its shape to accommodate his fear, to feed on his terror. Every corner of the place seemed to contain something that wanted to claim him, whether it was the shadows that slithered across the walls, or the cold, unfeeling eyes that watched him from the darkness. And above all, there was the sound, the distant, rhythmic thumping of something large moving through the halls, something that seemed to be waiting for him to turn a corner, to fall into its grasp. Jack could feel it now, the finality of it. He had tried to escape, to fight against the grip of the house, but it was futile. He had been running for so long, and each step had only led him deeper into its heart. There was no way out, no way to break free. And yet, there was a strange pull in his chest, a force that compelled him to keep moving. He could not give up, not yet. He had to keep fighting. For what? For his life? For his sanity? He wasn't sure, but there was a part of him that refused to surrender, that would not bow to whatever malevolent force haunted these walls. In the distance, he saw a flicker of light, a pale, sickly glow that pierced the darkness like a dying star. It was far off, just within reach, but something told him that this would be the end. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, that sinking sensation that told him that whatever he was about to face, he would not come back from it unchanged. Or perhaps he would not come back at all. The house's walls began to tremble, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate the very air around him. He could hear the floorboards creak and groan as if the house itself was preparing to swallow him whole. The whispers, too, grew louder, more frantic, urging him toward the light. "Come closer," they murmured. "It's the only way out. It's the only way to escape." Jack's heart raced as he moved toward the light, each step dragging him deeper into the heart of the house. The shadows seemed to lunge at him, reaching for his skin, grasping at his clothes, but he shoved them aside, not allowing himself to be distracted. He had to reach it, had to find the source of the glow. As he neared, he saw it more clearly. It was a door, half open, revealing a dimly lit room beyond. The light emanated from a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, its pale glow flickering like a candle in the wind. And there, in the center of the room, stood a figure. It was not human, not anymore. It had once been long ago, but now it was something else entirely. Something twisted and broken, a grotesque mockery of life. Its skin was pale and stretched too tightly over its bones, its eyes sunken into its skull, and its mouth was a jagged, gaping wound that never seemed to close. The figure smiled as Jack approached, a wide, twisted grin that sent a chill through his entire body. "Welcome," it whispered, its voice a mixture of mockery and triumph. "Welcome to the end." Jack's legs buckled beneath him, and he collapsed to his knees, his body shaking violently. He had been running for so long, seeking something, anything that might offer him escape. But there was no escape. Not now. The figure moved toward him, its movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. "You should have listened," it said softly. "You should have understood. There is no way out. You are mine now, forever." The light in the room flickered again, casting strange shadows that danced on the walls. The whispers in Jack's mind grew louder, more frantic, urging him to fight, to run, to do something, anything. But Jack's body refused to respond. His limbs were frozen, trapped in place by an invisible force. The darkness had claimed him. The figure reached down, its cold, bony hand brushing against Jack's cheek. "The house needs you," it said, its breath a rotten rasp. "It will feed on you, on your fear, on your pain. And when you are gone, you will join the others. Lost. Forgotten. Forever." Jack's eyes fluttered shut, and for a moment he felt himself drifting. The whispers began to fade, the light dimming, and the figure's laughter echoed through his mind like a distant, fading dream. But just as the darkness seemed to claim him entirely, something else stirred within him. A spark, a tiny flicker of defiance that had been buried deep beneath the terror. And in that instant, Jack opened his eyes, and for the first time since entering this house, he understood. The house had not claimed him yet. Not fully. With a guttural scream, he pushed against the floor, his body surging with newfound strength. The figure recoiled, its face twisting in anger. The light flickered wildly, casting strange, unnatural shadows across the room. Jack could feel the force of the house itself, struggling to drag him back, to drown him in its suffocating grip. But he refused to surrender. Not now. Not after everything. The door behind him slammed shut with a deafening crash, sealing him in the room with the figure. But it was too late. The house had lost. Jack was not going to be its victim. He reached deep into himself, pulling on the last reserves of his strength. His hand shot forward, grabbing the figure by the throat. It screeched, a high-pitched wail that shook the very walls of the house. The figure's form began to waver, flickering like a dying flame, as if it could not hold its shape any longer. Jack's grip tightened. "You will not have me," he growled, each word a defiant roar against the dark forces that had tried to claim him. And then, with one final, desperate push, the figure disintegrated in his hands, its form evaporating into nothingness, its final scream fading into the silence of the room. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the house was silent. The oppressive weight lifted, and the whispers ceased. Jack stood alone in the now empty room, his heart pounding in his chest. The air was still. The coldness receded. The house was no longer alive. And Jack was free for now.